What happens when struggling communities compete for the same limited opportunities? When survival strategies collide in the same narrow lane? When the shop on the corner becomes a symbol of everything you don't have? In townships across South Africa, in informal settlements in Kenya, in estates across the UK and Europe, Somali, Ethiopian, and Nigerian shops are being attacked, looted, and burned. Some say it's jealousy. Some say it's economics. Some say it's pure racism. Today we are going to get to the truth. All of it. The uncomfortable parts too. This is Griot Wave Academy African Civilisations Series. Before we continue, it is important to understand the mission behind Griot Wave Academy. This platform was created to preserve knowledge, culture, music, and stories that often go unheard or are forgotten. Griot Wave is not just about content. It is about building independent systems of learning, creativity, and empowerment. Through books, audio, technology, and media, the goal is to transform timeless wisdom into practical tools for today's generation and future generations. This slide takes us to the heart of the issue. Too often, conversations about Afrophobia are reduced to simple explanations. Some say it is purely racism. Others say it is purely economics. But reality is more complicated. Consider the question before us. What happens when millions of people are struggling, jobs are scarce, services are collapsing, and opportunities feel out of reach? When a Somali shop is attacked, what are we really witnessing? Racism may be part of the story. Economic competition may be part of the story. Fear, misinformation, and political manipulation may all play a role. But if we stop there, we miss the bigger picture. Because the deeper question is not simply why one poor community attacks another. The deeper question is why both communities were placed in conditions where they see each other as enemies in the first place. History shows us that when systems fail to provide security, dignity, jobs, and hope, people often look for someone to blame. And the easiest targets are usually those closest to them, not necessarily those most responsible for their suffering. That is why this is not just a story about race, though race matters. It is not just a story about economics, though economics matters. It is a story about what happens when frustration is redirected sideways instead of upward. When the unemployed blame migrants instead of failed policies. When struggling communities fight each other instead of confronting the conditions that make everyone vulnerable. And that leads us to the most important question on this slide. Who benefits when the poor fight the poor? Because whenever ordinary people are divided, distracted, and competing against one another, someone else escapes scrutiny. To understand the fire, we must look beyond the flames and examine who built the conditions that allowed it to spread. Before we dive into the evidence, let's take a moment to understand the journey ahead. This topic is emotional. It touches on identity, survival, migration, economics, and community tensions. Too often, people approach it with strong opinions but very little context. Our goal today is not to inflame emotions. It is to understand reality. In Chapter 1, we will examine the phenomenon itself. Where do these attacks happen? How often do they occur? Which communities are most affected? Before discussing causes, we need to understand the facts. In Chapter 2, we explore the informal economy. Why do many migrant-owned shops succeed in highly competitive environments? What business practices do they use? And why has that success become a source of tension in some communities? In Chapter 3, we move beyond headlines to examine community tensions. We will ask a difficult question. What actually triggers violence? Is it hatred alone? Or are unemployment, poverty, weak governance, and political scapegoating also part of the story? In Chapter 4, we confront myths versus reality. We will investigate some of the most common claims made about migrant businesses and test them against evidence, data, and lived experience. Finally, in Chapter 5, we focus on solutions. Because understanding a problem is only useful if it helps us solve it. We will explore what governments, communities, businesses, and ordinary citizens can do to reduce tensions and build cooperation. This is not a story about heroes and villains. It is a story about people struggling within systems that often fail them. And by the end of this presentation, I hope we will move beyond blame and toward understanding, because only understanding can lead to lasting solutions. We begin our investigation with the facts. Before we debate causes, assign blame, or propose solutions, we must first understand the phenomenon itself. Because one of the biggest problems in discussions about xenophobia and Afrophobia is that people often start with opinions instead of evidence. So let us begin with a simple question. What exactly is happening? When most people think about xenophobic violence, they picture dramatic images from the news: burning shops, angry crowds, police sirens, and frightened families fleeing their homes. But headlines only show us the explosion. They rarely show us the conditions that made the explosion possible. In this chapter, we will examine where these incidents occur, how frequently they happen, and which communities are most affected. We will look at the patterns, because patterns tell stories. Why do attacks often occur in areas with high unemployment? Why are informal settlements and struggling townships frequently at the center of these tensions? Why are certain migrant communities repeatedly targeted while others are not? And why do these outbreaks tend to flare up during periods of economic stress, political uncertainty, or local elections? These are not random events. They follow identifiable trends. But understanding those trends requires us to move beyond emotion and examine the evidence. This chapter is not about defending anyone. It is not about condemning anyone. It is about understanding reality as honestly as possible. Because if we misunderstand the problem, we will misunderstand the solution. And if we want to prevent future violence, we must first understand what drives it. So let us put assumptions aside, follow the data wherever it leads, and begin with the facts. What exactly is happening? And why does it keep happening? One of the most important myths about xenophobic violence is that it is unique to one country. It is not. When we examine the evidence, a pattern begins to emerge across multiple regions and even multiple continents. Look at the communities most frequently targeted: Somali traders, Ethiopian entrepreneurs, Nigerian business owners, Zimbabwean migrants, Rwandan and Burundian workers. Different countries, different political systems, different histories, yet the same pattern appears again and again. Why? Because the issue is often less about nationality and more about economics, visibility, and perceived competition. In South Africa, attacks have repeatedly concentrated in townships and informal settlements, where unemployment and poverty are highest. Migrant-owned shops often become symbols of economic frustration, regardless of whether they are responsible for local hardship. In Nairobi, Somali traders in Eastleigh have faced repeated hostility, despite contributing significantly to the local economy. Their success has often made them highly visible targets. In Tanzania and Uganda, governments have at times framed expulsions and business restrictions as matters of security or national interest, affecting entire migrant communities. Even beyond Africa, similar patterns appear. In parts of Europe and the United Kingdom, immigrant-owned businesses have been targeted during periods of economic anxiety, social unrest, and political tension. This tells us something important. The geography changes, the languages change, the politics change, but the underlying dynamics remain remarkably similar. When communities feel economically insecure, visible minorities and migrant entrepreneurs often become convenient scapegoats. That does not excuse violence, but it helps explain why it happens. The lesson of this slide is that we are not looking at isolated incidents. We are looking at a recurring global pattern. And if the pattern is global, then the deeper causes may not lie in culture alone, but in what happens when struggling communities compete for limited opportunities in systems that are failing many of the people within them. As we examine the phenomenon of targeted violence, it is important to move beyond statistics and see the people behind the headlines. Because when communities are discussed only as numbers, it becomes easier to stereotype them. This slide highlights 3 groups that are frequently visible in migrant business networks across Africa and beyond: Somali traders, Ethiopian entrepreneurs, and Nigerian business owners. What is striking is that despite their different histories, they share several common characteristics. First, they often operate in sectors that many local businesses have abandoned or overlooked. Small retail shops, food services, logistics, telecommunications, money transfers, and informal trade networks require long hours, high risk tolerance, and strong family support systems. Second, these communities rely heavily on trust networks. Relatives pool capital. Families share resources. New arrivals receive support from established members of the community. These networks create resilience, where formal financial systems often fail. Third, many members of these communities arrived not as wealthy investors, but as migrants, refugees, or economic survivors searching for opportunity. Their businesses often emerge from necessity rather than privilege. Yet success can create visibility. And visibility can create resentment. A thriving Somali shop in a struggling township, an Ethiopian-owned logistics business, or a Nigerian entrepreneur building a successful enterprise can become symbols onto which wider frustrations are projected. This is a pattern seen throughout history. When economic conditions deteriorate, highly visible minority business communities often become targets of suspicion, regardless of their actual role in creating local problems. The lesson here is not that these communities are perfect. The lesson is that their stories are more complex than the stereotypes. To understand the tensions surrounding migrant businesses, we must first understand who these people are, how they built their enterprises, and why their success generates both admiration and controversy. Because understanding people is the first step toward understanding the conflict itself. Numbers can sometimes feel cold and abstract, but every number on this slide represents real people, real communities, real businesses, and real consequences. Let's start with the first figure: more than 30,000 Somali-owned shops in South Africa alone. That tells us something important. Somali entrepreneurs are not a small or isolated presence. They are deeply embedded in local economies, especially in townships and underserved communities where formal retail is often limited. Now look at the second number. Over 700 deaths linked to xenophobic and anti-migrant violence in South Africa since 2008. This is not a handful of isolated incidents. It is a recurring social crisis that has unfolded over more than a decade, affecting families, livelihoods, and entire communities. Then consider the economic dimension. Nigerian diaspora remittances exceed $20 billion annually. That is not just money crossing borders. It is school fees, healthcare, housing, business investment, and family support. In many cases, remittances provide a larger economic lifeline than foreign aid. The figure of 250,000 African-owned businesses in the UK reminds us that migration is not simply about movement. It is also about entrepreneurship, job creation, and economic contribution. African communities are building wealth and opportunity far beyond the continent itself. The 40% statistic highlights another reality. In some South African townships, a significant share of informal sector activity is operated by foreign nationals. Whether one sees that as success, competition, or both, it helps explain why economic tensions become so politically charged. Finally, the estimated $1.2 billion in losses during the 2021 unrest demonstrates that violence carries enormous economic costs. Shops are destroyed, jobs disappear, supply chains break down, and entire communities suffer. Taken together, these numbers reveal a simple truth. This issue is too large to dismiss as a few isolated incidents. It is a major social, economic, and political challenge. To understand it, we must look beyond emotion and headlines and examine the forces that produce these outcomes in the first place. We now arrive at one of the most important, and often misunderstood, parts of this entire discussion. When violence erupts against migrant-owned shops, the explanation many people reach for is simple: foreigners are taking over. But reality is far more complex. To understand what is happening, we need to examine the informal economy, the economic space where millions of Africans survive outside formal employment. In countries with high unemployment, especially among young people, small businesses become more than businesses. They become lifelines. Across South Africa, Kenya, the United Kingdom, and many other countries, migrant entrepreneurs have become highly visible in local retail sectors. Somali traders, Ethiopian entrepreneurs, Nigerian business owners, and others often operate in communities where formal investment is limited. They open early, close late, work long hours, and frequently rely on family networks, collective purchasing, and community financing. The question we must ask is not simply, why do migrant shops exist? The deeper question is, why do some of them succeed where others struggle? This chapter is not about blaming local communities, nor is it about romanticizing migrant entrepreneurs. It is about understanding the economic dynamics that create both success and resentment. When unemployment is high, when opportunities are scarce, and when governments fail to deliver meaningful economic growth, every successful business can become a symbol of competition. Economic frustration is then transformed into social tension. But there is a critical distinction we must make. Competition is not the same as hostility. Economic hardship does not automatically produce violence. Something else must happen before neighbors become enemies. Over the next few sections, we will examine the business models, networks, myths, and realities behind migrant entrepreneurship. We will separate facts from rumors, evidence from assumptions, and emotion from analysis. Because if we truly want solutions, we must first understand the economics behind the conflict, not just the conflict itself. Before we can understand why migrant-owned businesses become targets, we must first understand the economic system in which they operate. When most people think about an economy, they imagine large corporations, factories, banks, shopping centers, and government institutions. But for millions of Africans, that is not where economic life happens. Africa's real economic engine is often invisible. The informal economy, street traders, market vendors, spaza shops, hawkers, transport operators, mobile money agents, and countless small enterprises, accounts for an estimated 55% of Africa's GDP and provides livelihoods for the vast majority of working people across the continent. This is not a side economy, it is the economy. For many families, there is no formal job waiting. There is no corporate salary. Survival depends on creating opportunity where none exists. A market stall, a food kiosk, a corner shop, or a small logistics business can mean the difference between poverty and stability. Who operates in this space? Primarily ordinary people, women supporting families, unemployed youth creating their own work, rural migrants seeking opportunity, and increasingly, migrants from other African countries. This is where much of the tension begins. When local economies struggle, competition inside the informal sector becomes intense. The same limited customer base, the same streets, the same communities, and the same scarce opportunities are shared by everyone. Yet we must remember something important. These businesses perform a critical social function. In South Africa alone, millions of township residents rely on spaza shops and informal retailers for daily necessities. They provide food, household goods, credit, convenience, and access, where formal retail chains often do not reach. That is why attacks on these businesses are never just attacks on individual shop owners. They disrupt entire communities. As we move forward, keep this central idea in mind. The informal economy is not a problem to be solved. It is a survival system created by people responding to economic realities. To understand the conflicts surrounding migrant businesses, we must first understand the vital role this hidden engine plays in African life. This slide addresses one of the most controversial questions in this entire discussion. Why do migrant-owned shops often appear to outperform local businesses? Before we begin, it is important to state what this is not. This is not a story about superior intelligence, secret advantages, or conspiracy theories. It is not about one group being better than another. It is about structure, networks, and incentives. Many migrant entrepreneurs arrive with very little. What they often possess, however, is something equally valuable: strong community networks. Take collective capital pooling. Across Africa, communities have long used rotating saving systems, whether Somali Ayuto, Ethiopian Ikub, or Igbo Aho. These systems allow entrepreneurs to raise startup capital without needing banks, collateral, or formal credit histories. Next is buying power. When dozens or hundreds of traders purchase goods together, they negotiate lower wholesale prices. This means they can sell products more cheaply while still making a profit. Operating costs also matter. Family members often work together, share accommodation, rotate shifts, and reduce labor expenses. A shop becomes both a business and a survival network. Longer trading hours create another advantage. Many migrant-owned stores open earlier and close later than competitors, serving customers when others are unavailable. Then there is customer credit. In many low-income communities, informal credit can be the difference between feeding a family and going hungry. Shopkeepers who build trust through flexible payment arrangements often gain loyal customers. Finally, there is risk tolerance. A refugee or migrant who has already lost everything may be willing to operate in locations others avoid. What looks like extraordinary courage is often the reality of having few alternatives. The key lesson is this: success is usually not about nationality. It is about networks, organization, cooperation, and business models. Instead of asking, why are they succeeding? Perhaps the more useful question is, what can communities learn from these systems and adapt for themselves? Because understanding success is far more productive than resenting it. One of the biggest myths surrounding migrant-owned businesses is that their success is mysterious. People see a small spaza shop selling products more cheaply than competitors and assume something unfair must be happening. But when we examine the supply chain, the picture becomes much clearer. What you're looking at here is not magic, it is organization. The process begins with manufacturers and importers supplying goods into major commercial centers, such as Johannesburg and Cape Town. From there, community-based wholesale hubs purchase products in large volumes. Because they buy in bulk, they negotiate prices that individual shop owners simply cannot access. Those goods are then distributed through trusted regional networks. Community members with vehicles transport products efficiently to local areas, reducing costs and ensuring reliable supply. At the retail level, family-run spaza shops operate long hours, often extending credit to trusted customers. They serve communities that larger supermarkets frequently overlook or cannot profitably reach. The final link in the chain is the township consumer. Millions of residents depend on these shops for daily essentials. For many households, the local spaza is not just convenient. It is the primary source of food, household goods, and emergency credit. What is particularly important is that value is created at every stage of the network. Wholesalers benefit. Distributors benefit. Shop owners benefit. Consumers gain access to affordable products. And there is another overlooked reality. South African manufacturers benefit too. Their products reach communities they might otherwise struggle to serve directly. This means the network is not simply a migrant story. It is an economic ecosystem involving suppliers, transporters, retailers, and consumers. Understanding this changes the conversation. The issue is not that one group discovered a secret formula. The issue is that highly organized supply chains often outperform fragmented individual businesses. The lesson is profound. Success in modern economies rarely comes from isolated individuals. It comes from networks, cooperation, scale, and trust. The real question is not why these networks work. The real question is how more communities can build them. We now arrive at the most difficult part of our discussion. Up to this point, we have examined the economics behind migrant businesses. We have looked at networks, supply chains, and the informal economy. But economics alone does not explain why frustration sometimes turns into violence. That is what this chapter is about. Community tensions do not emerge overnight. They build slowly. They grow when unemployment remains high year after year. They grow when young people see few opportunities. They grow when public services fail, when housing is scarce, when crime rises, and when communities feel abandoned by those in power. Under those conditions, people naturally look for explanations. The tragedy is that the easiest explanation is often the wrong one. Instead of asking why jobs are scarce, why economic growth is weak, or why corruption persists, attention is redirected toward the most visible outsiders. The migrant shop owner becomes the symbol of a much larger frustration. But symbols are not causes. A Somali trader did not create mass unemployment. An Ethiopian entrepreneur did not design a failing education system. A Nigerian shopkeeper did not cause decades of inequality. Yet in moments of anger and desperation, those distinctions can disappear. This is why violence is rarely just about nationality. It is often the result of deeper pressures that have been building for years beneath the surface. We must also be honest about another reality. Community tensions are not unique to Africa. Similar patterns have appeared throughout history, in Europe, Asia, the Americas, and elsewhere. Whenever economic insecurity combines with political manipulation and social fear, outsiders become convenient targets. That does not excuse violence. It helps explain it. As we move through this chapter, we will examine the real triggers behind these tensions: unemployment, inequality, political rhetoric, crime narratives, misinformation, and institutional failure. Because if we misdiagnose the problem, we will never solve it. The goal is not to assign blame. The goal is to understand why communities reach a breaking point, and how that cycle can be broken before frustration becomes violence and neighbors become enemies. This slide may be the most important in the entire presentation because it moves us beyond emotion and into evidence. When violence erupts, people often search for a single cause. But decades of research show that there is rarely one explanation. Community tensions emerge when several pressures combine and reinforce one another. The first and most significant factor is unemployment and economic desperation. In communities where unemployment is extremely high, competition for customers, jobs, housing, and opportunity becomes intense. Economic anxiety creates fertile ground for conflict long before violence begins. The second factor is perceived unfair advantage. Many local residents see migrant-owned businesses opening longer hours, selling at lower prices, and surviving in difficult conditions. Without understanding the networks, purchasing systems, and family support structures behind that success, it can appear unfair, even when no rules have been broken. Third is the failure of service delivery. When people lack reliable housing, water, electricity, sanitation, healthcare, and economic opportunity, frustration accumulates. Over time, visible businesses and successful entrepreneurs can become symbols of inequality rather than examples of resilience. Fourth is political manipulation. Throughout history, struggling leaders have often redirected public anger toward vulnerable groups rather than addressing deeper structural problems. Migrants are easy targets because they usually have limited political influence and few mechanisms for protection. Fifth, there are genuine cultural and communication challenges. Language barriers, different business practices, and social separation can create misunderstandings. These differences are often exaggerated by rumors, media narratives, and stereotypes. Finally, there is organized crime and extortion. In some cases, attacks that appear to be community anger are actually linked to criminal networks targeting businesses for money, protection payments, or territorial control. The key lesson is this: violence is rarely caused by migrants themselves. It emerges when economic hardship, political opportunism, social frustration, misinformation, and criminal interests intersect. If we focus only on the visible target, we miss the deeper causes. And when we misidentify the cause, we end up fighting symptoms, while the real problem continues to grow beneath the surface. One of the most revealing ways to understand this issue is to step back and look at the timeline. When people discuss attacks on migrants or foreign-owned businesses, they are often presented as isolated incidents, random explosions of anger that emerge without warning. But when we examine the historical record, a different picture appears. Notice what connects many of these events. In 2008, South Africa experienced one of its deadliest xenophobic waves, leaving dozens dead and thousands displaced. In 2014, Nairobi's Eastleigh district, often called Little Mogadishu, became the focus of sweeping security operations following terrorist attacks. In 2015, inflammatory public statements preceded another wave of violence in South Africa. In 2019, rumors spread rapidly through social media, helping fuel attacks on migrant-owned businesses. In 2021, economic frustration and political instability during the KwaZulu-Natal unrest created conditions where many foreign-owned shops became targets. And in 2024, we saw similar patterns in parts of the United Kingdom, where misinformation and fear were directed toward immigrant communities. Different countries, different circumstances, different communities. Yet the pattern is remarkably consistent. Violence rarely appears in periods of stability. It tends to emerge during moments of crisis, economic downturns, political uncertainty, elections, security scares, social unrest, or major public controversies. That observation is important because it changes the question we ask. Instead of asking, why are migrants being attacked, we must also ask, what else was happening in society when these attacks occurred? Often migrants become the visible target of pressures that originated elsewhere. Research repeatedly shows that economic shocks, inflammatory rhetoric, misinformation, and political instability create environments where fear spreads quickly and scapegoating becomes easier. This does not mean every incident has the same cause, but it does suggest that these events are not random. The lesson from this timeline is clear. If we want to prevent future violence, we must pay attention to the warning signs. Economic stress, political opportunism, social media rumors, and public inflammatory language are often not consequences of violence. They are precursors to it. History is showing us a pattern. The question is whether we are willing to learn from it. If you are serious about Africa's future, you must also become serious about personal growth, execution, discipline, entrepreneurship, and building. Knowledge without implementation changes nothing. That is exactly why I'm building the Griot Wave Inner Circle, an execution-focused community for builders, creators, entrepreneurs, and purpose-driven individuals. A space focused on accountability, implementation, entrepreneurship, transformation, AI and digital leverage, community, and real progress. Weekly live sessions, execution systems, focused builders, real conversations, real growth. If you are tired of consuming endlessly and ready to start building intentionally, scan the QR code or use the link below to join the early interest list. Stop consuming, start building. Don't build alone. Join the Griot Wave Inner Circle and connect with a community focused on real execution and transformation. Scan the QR code to begin. Xenophobia is not always spontaneous. In many cases, it is politically useful. Throughout history, leaders facing economic frustration, unemployment, rising inequality, or declining public trust have often searched for someone else to blame. When governments cannot explain why living conditions are worsening, the temptation is to redirect public anger toward a visible and vulnerable group. That is where migrants often enter the story. Notice the pattern. When unemployment is high, it is easier to say, foreigners are taking your jobs, than to explain decades of policy failures. When crime rises, it is easier to blame outsiders than address deeper social problems. Scapegoating offers simple answers to complex challenges. But political rhetoric rarely stays in the realm of words. Words shape perceptions. Perceptions shape attitudes. And attitudes can shape actions. Research from multiple countries has shown that inflammatory political statements often precede spikes in anti-migrant sentiment and violence. Once a public figure legitimizes hostility, some people interpret it as permission to act. The role of social media has amplified this dynamic dramatically. Rumors, misinformation, edited videos, and inflammatory messages can now spread across communities in minutes, rather than weeks. False stories often travel faster than verified facts, creating fear and anger before evidence can catch up. Equally concerning is the issue of accountability. When leaders make reckless statements without consequences, a dangerous message is sent that targeting outsiders is politically acceptable. Finally, there is the question of state response. Communities pay close attention to whether authorities act decisively during periods of violence. Delayed responses, weak enforcement, or perceived indifference can create the impression that attacks will carry little consequence. The lesson here is not that politicians create xenophobia out of nothing. Rather, they can magnify existing frustrations, direct them toward convenient targets, and transform social tensions into political capital. That is why understanding xenophobia requires more than studying economics. We must also examine power, incentives, narratives, and the ways fear can be mobilized for political gain. The critical question is simple. When communities are angry, who benefits from directing that anger away from those in power and toward those with the least power to defend themselves? Throughout this presentation, we have discussed statistics, economics, politics, and history. We have examined trends, patterns, and systems. But before we move forward, we need to remember something important. Behind every statistic is a human being. When we hear that a shop was burned, it is easy to think about property damage. What we often forget is that a shop may represent 10 years of work, a family's savings, a child's school fees, or an entire community's access to food and credit. Listen to the first testimony. A man spends years building a business, serving his community, extending credit when families are struggling, only to lose everything in a single night. The tragedy is not only economic, it is psychological. It is the feeling of no longer belonging in a place you helped build. Then we hear a different voice, a local South African customer. Her testimony reminds us that communities are rarely as divided as headlines suggest. She does not see the shopkeeper as an outsider. She sees someone who helped her family survive difficult times. When the shop disappears, the community suffers too. The third testimony asks perhaps the most difficult question on this slide: am I the enemy? It is a question that forces us to confront our assumptions. Many migrants are not isolated from local economies. They employ local workers, pay taxes, purchase goods from local suppliers, rent local properties, and contribute to the communities where they live. Their success, and the success of their host communities, are often interconnected. What these voices reveal is that xenophobia is not simply a clash between locals and foreigners. It is often a tragedy that harms both. The shop owner loses a livelihood. The customer loses a trusted service. Workers lose jobs. Communities lose investment. Trust breaks down. And perhaps that is the greatest human cost of all. When fear replaces solidarity, everyone becomes poorer, not only economically, but socially and morally as well. These stories remind us that behind every debate about migration, identity, and belonging are real people seeking exactly the same things: safety, dignity, opportunity, and a chance to build a better life for their families. We now arrive at one of the most important parts of this presentation. Everything we have examined so far, the violence, the tensions, the political rhetoric, the economic frustration, rests on a set of powerful beliefs. Beliefs repeated so often that many people accept them as facts. But what if some of the things we think we know are simply not true? This chapter is about separating perception from reality. When communities are under pressure, people naturally search for explanations. Why are jobs scarce? Why are local businesses struggling? Why do some shops seem to succeed while others fail? Why does inequality persist? Complex answers are difficult. Simple answers are attractive. And that is where myths become dangerous. Throughout history, societies facing hardship have often looked for visible targets to blame. Migrants, minorities, outsiders, and newcomers frequently become convenient explanations for problems that actually have much deeper causes. The challenge is that myths do not need to be true to be powerful. They only need to be repeated. A rumor shared enough times begins to sound like common sense. A stereotype repeated often enough begins to feel like reality. And eventually, false beliefs can influence public policy, shape community attitudes, and even justify violence. In this chapter, we will examine 5 of the most common claims made about foreign-owned shops and migrant entrepreneurs. We will ask difficult questions. Do migrants really steal jobs? Do foreign businesses receive special treatment? Do they send all their money out of the country? Do they refuse to integrate into local communities? And most importantly, what does the evidence actually show? This is not about defending one group against another. It is about defending facts against misinformation. Because lasting solutions can only be built on truth. If we misunderstand the problem, we will continue fighting the wrong battles. But if we understand what is really happening beneath the surface, we can begin addressing the root causes rather than the symptoms. So let us put assumptions aside and follow the evidence wherever it leads. The goal of this chapter is simple: not to confirm what we already believe, but to discover what is actually true. Now we come to the first and perhaps most common claim made during periods of economic hardship: foreign shops are stealing our jobs. It is a powerful statement because it appeals to a very real frustration. When unemployment is high, when families are struggling, and when opportunities feel scarce, it is natural for people to ask, if migrants were not here, would there be more work for us? But the evidence tells a more complicated story. Notice that most migrant-owned shops are not replacing existing jobs. They are creating businesses that often did not exist before. A spaza shop, restaurant, transport service, or grocery store is not simply a job taken. It is an enterprise built from the ground up. And every enterprise creates economic activity. It needs suppliers. It needs transport. It needs maintenance. It serves customers. Many hire local workers directly or indirectly. In other words, these businesses become part of a larger economic ecosystem. Think about the numbers on this slide. Even if every foreign-owned spaza shop disappeared tomorrow, the number of jobs freed up would be tiny compared to the millions of unemployed people already searching for work. The unemployment crisis would remain. That tells us something important. The real causes of unemployment are not Somali shopkeepers, Ethiopian entrepreneurs, or Nigerian traders. They are deeper structural issues: weak economic growth, failing education systems, automation, corruption, poor infrastructure, and insufficient investment. Research from around the world consistently finds that migrants are more likely to complement local labor than replace it. They often fill gaps, create businesses, and expand economic activity. This does not mean local frustrations are imaginary. The pain is real. The unemployment is real. But if we blame migrants for problems they did not create, we risk attacking symptoms while leaving the root causes untouched. The question we should ask is not, who can we blame? The question is, why is the economy failing to create enough opportunities for everyone? Because solving that problem creates jobs. Scapegoating does not. The second myth is one that appears again and again in community conversations. Foreign shop owners are receiving government grants, special treatment, or hidden support. For many people, this belief seems to explain why some migrant-owned businesses survive in difficult economic conditions while others struggle. But when we examine the evidence, the picture looks very different. In reality, many migrant entrepreneurs operate with fewer advantages than local citizens. Consider banking. Many asylum seekers and undocumented migrants face significant barriers when opening formal bank accounts, accessing loans, or obtaining business credit. This means they often rely heavily on cash transactions and informal financial systems. That is not an advantage. It is a challenge. Next, look at government support. The major state-funded business development programs in South Africa are generally designed for citizens and permanent residents. Foreign entrepreneurs are often excluded from grants, subsidized financing, and official business support initiatives. So if the state is not funding these businesses, where does the capital come from? The answer lies in community networks. Across Africa, rotating savings groups, family lending systems, diaspora remittances, and community credit circles have helped people start businesses for generations. Somali Ayuto, Ethiopian Ikub, Nigerian-owned, and many similar systems provide access to capital without banks. These are not government subsidies. They are examples of communities pooling resources to help one another succeed. Another misconception is that migrant businesses avoid taxes or regulations. In reality, registered businesses are subject to the same tax obligations, municipal fees, and licensing requirements as everyone else. Many foreign entrepreneurs face additional administrative hurdles because they lack local networks and political connections. The key lesson from this slide is simple. Success is not necessarily evidence of special treatment. Sometimes success comes from organization, cooperation, sacrifice, and strong community support systems. That does not mean every business succeeds. Many fail. Many operate under difficult conditions. But the evidence does not support the idea that migrant entrepreneurs are thriving because governments are secretly helping them. If anything, many succeed despite state barriers, not because of state support. The third myth is one of the most emotionally charged. Foreign shops exploit the community. They take money out and give nothing back. At first glance, this argument can seem convincing. People see remittances being sent abroad and assume that money is simply disappearing from the local economy. But let's look at the full picture. Every business moves money. The real question is, where does the money go before it leaves? Most migrant-owned shops are deeply embedded in the communities they serve. They rent local properties. They pay municipal fees. They buy electricity and water. They purchase stock from wholesalers and manufacturers. They hire security guards, cleaners, drivers, packers, and casual workers. They pay transport operators and landlords. In many cases, they provide something even more valuable: informal credit. For countless families living paycheck to paycheck, the local spaza shop is often the only place where someone can say, "I'll pay at the end of the month." That service keeps households afloat during difficult times. These businesses also provide access to food and household goods in areas that large retailers often consider unprofitable. Many township residents rely on these shops because the nearest supermarket may be kilometers away. Now let's address the issue of remittances. Yes, some profits are sent abroad to support family members, but that is not unique to migrants. Large corporations routinely transfer billions in profits and dividends across borders to international shareholders. In fact, the amount leaving through multinational corporate structures often dwarfs what a small shop owner could ever remit. The irony is that critics often focus on the most visible flow of money, while ignoring the largest ones. The evidence suggests that migrant-owned businesses do not simply extract wealth from communities. They participate in local economic life, create services, support suppliers, and generate employment. This does not mean every business owner is perfect. It means the narrative that foreign shops contribute nothing is not supported by reality. The better question is not whether money leaves a community. The better question is, how much value is created before it does? And in many communities, the answer is quite a lot. We now arrive at the final two myths in our journey, and both touch on some of the deepest fears communities can have: safety and belonging. The first claim is that foreign shop owners bring crime into communities. This belief is widespread, but the evidence points in a very different direction. In many documented cases, migrant-owned businesses are not the primary perpetrators of crime. They are among its most frequent victims. Foreign-owned shops are often targeted for robbery, extortion, looting, and protection rackets. Because these business owners may have limited political influence, language barriers, or uncertain legal status, criminal groups often view them as easier targets. In some communities, migrant entrepreneurs pay so-called protection fees simply to stay open. That is not evidence of criminal power. It is evidence of vulnerability. The second myth is that migrants do not integrate, that they arrive, take resources, and remain permanently separate from society. Again, reality is more complex. Integration is not a single event. It is a process that unfolds over years and generations. Across South Africa, Kenya, the United Kingdom, and many other countries, migrant communities have produced teachers, doctors, engineers, business owners, religious leaders, and community organizers. Their children attend local schools, speak local languages, build friendships, and often identify strongly with the countries in which they were raised. Of course, cultural differences exist. Language barriers exist. Misunderstandings occur. But these are normal features of migration throughout human history. What matters is whether communities build bridges or barriers. The larger lesson from both myths is that visibility often creates suspicion. People who sound different, dress differently, worship differently, or run businesses differently are easily perceived as outsiders. But difference is not danger. And separation is not proof of hostility. When we look beyond stereotypes, we find something familiar. People trying to provide for their families, build a future, and find a place where they belong. The challenge before us is not learning how to fear one another. It is learning how to live together in societies that are becoming increasingly interconnected, diverse, and dependent on one another. That is not a migrant challenge. It is a human challenge. We have now reached a crucial moment in this presentation. For several chapters, we have examined the claims most often used to explain or justify hostility toward migrant-owned businesses. We looked at the data. We examined the research. We explored the economics. And now we can step back and ask a simple question. What survived contact with the evidence? This scorecard summarizes what we found. The first claim, that foreign shops steal local jobs, does not hold up. The evidence shows that migrant businesses create economic activity, support employment, and provide services in areas often underserved by the formal economy. The second claim, that migrant entrepreneurs receive government grants or special treatment, also collapses under scrutiny. In reality, many face barriers to banking, financing, and formal support programs that citizens can access. The third claim, that they exploit communities and take all the money away, is the only one with a grain of truth. Yes, some profits are remitted abroad, but that is only part of the story. These businesses also spend locally, employ locally, purchase locally, and contribute to local economies. The reality is far more balanced than the myth suggests. The fourth claim, that foreign shop owners bring crime into communities, is contradicted by the evidence. In many cases, they are more likely to be victims of crime than perpetrators, often facing robbery, extortion, and targeted violence. And the fifth claim, that migrants do not integrate, is disproven by the experiences of countless second-generation families who attend local schools, speak local languages, and contribute to every sector of society. Now notice something important. This scorecard does not mean community frustrations are imaginary. Unemployment is real. Poverty is real. Crime is real. Inequality is real. But the evidence suggests that migrant shop owners are not the primary cause of those problems. And that changes the conversation. Because once a society realizes it has been asking the wrong questions, it can finally begin searching for the right answers. The most important takeaway from this slide is not that every migrant is innocent, or every local grievance is invalid. It is that violence built on false assumptions can never solve real problems. If we want solutions, we must follow evidence, not narratives. And the evidence tells us that the roots of economic hardship lie far deeper than the nearest foreign-owned shop. We have spent this presentation examining a difficult subject. We explored the violence. We examined the myths. We looked at the economics. We listened to the voices of those affected. And perhaps most importantly, we asked what the evidence actually shows. Now we arrive at the most important chapter of all. Because understanding a problem is only valuable if it helps us solve it. This chapter is not about blame. It is about responsibility. If the causes of tension are unemployment, inequality, failing services, political manipulation, misinformation, and social fragmentation, then the solution cannot simply be remove the foreigners. As we have seen, that does not solve the underlying issues. The challenge before us is larger than migration. It is about building societies where people do not feel abandoned. It is about creating economies that generate opportunity rather than competition over scarcity. It is about ensuring that political leaders address real problems instead of finding convenient scapegoats. And it is about strengthening communities so that diversity becomes a source of resilience rather than conflict. The good news is that these problems are not beyond our ability to solve. History shows that societies can overcome division when they choose cooperation over fear, facts over rumors, and long-term solutions over short-term anger. But that choice does not belong only to governments. It belongs to community leaders. It belongs to educators. It belongs to business owners. It belongs to the media. And it belongs to ordinary citizens. Because every act of violence begins with an idea. And every act of peace begins with one too. The question before us is simple. What kind of society do we want to build? One where people compete over shrinking opportunities and blame one another for systemic failures? Or one where communities work together to address the real causes of poverty, unemployment, and insecurity? The future will be shaped by the answer. In the next few slides, we will move from diagnoses to action. Not what is wrong, but what can be done. Not who to blame, but how to build something better. Because if division is learned, solidarity can be learned too. And if these problems were created by human choices, they can also be solved by human choices. Throughout this presentation, we have repeatedly returned to one central conclusion. Violence against migrants is not caused by migrants. It is the product of deeper failures, economic, political, and institutional. That means governments have a responsibility that goes far beyond simply responding after violence erupts. Their role is to address the conditions that allow tensions to grow in the first place. The first responsibility is accountability. When politicians use inflammatory language, spread fear, or blame vulnerable communities for economic problems, there must be consequences. Hate speech and incitement laws already exist in many countries. The challenge is enforcement. No society can claim to oppose xenophobic violence while allowing public figures to encourage it without consequence. Second, governments must create fair competition. The lesson from this presentation is not that foreign entrepreneurs should be punished for succeeding. The lesson is that local entrepreneurs should be given the tools to compete successfully as well. Access to affordable credit, business training, cooperative purchasing networks, and market opportunities should be available to township and community entrepreneurs. The goal is not exclusion, it is empowerment. Third, governments must confront the real source of frustration: unemployment. When millions of people cannot find work, social tensions become inevitable. Lasting peace requires economic growth, industrial development, infrastructure investment, and policies that create meaningful opportunities. The migrant shop owner is visible, but unemployment is the deeper problem. Finally, governments have a duty to protect every person living within their borders. Whether someone is a citizen, migrant, refugee, or asylum seeker, the rule of law must apply equally. Violence cannot be tolerated. Police cannot stand by, as businesses are looted and communities are attacked. Protection is not a favor granted to some. It is a basic responsibility of the state. Taken together, these four actions form a simple principle. Governments cannot solve social tensions through scapegoating. They solve them through justice, opportunity, accountability, and equal protection under the law. If those foundations are strong, communities become more resilient. If they are weak, division will continue to flourish. The choice ultimately belongs to political leaders, but the consequences are felt by everyone. If governments have a responsibility to create fair policies and economic opportunity, communities have an equally important responsibility: building resilience from the ground up. Violence rarely begins in parliament. It begins in neighborhoods, with rumors, frustration, mistrust, and a lack of meaningful relationships between people living side by side. The first response must be economic. Across Africa, traditions of collective finance, stokvels, aho, chama, ekulub, and other rotating credit systems already mobilize billions in community capital. Rather than focusing solely on consumption, these resources can support cooperative businesses, local enterprises, and shared ownership models. The goal is not to destroy successful competitors, but to build successful alternatives. Second, communities must move beyond slogans and create real support systems for local entrepreneurs. Buy local is not enough. Entrepreneurs need access to bulk purchasing, shared storage, business incubators, mentorship networks, and community investment funds. These structures can provide the same advantages that successful migrant business networks have built over time. Third, communities need spaces for dialogue before tensions become crises. When residents, business owners, faith leaders, counselors, and community representatives meet regularly, problems can be identified early and resolved before they escalate into conflict. Prevention is always cheaper than repair. Finally, communities must become active defenders of truth. Many outbreaks of xenophobic violence have been fueled by rumors, misinformation, and inflammatory social media content. A false message shared thousands of times can be as destructive as any weapon. Citizens must verify claims, challenge misinformation, and refuse to spread narratives that demonize entire groups. The deeper lesson is simple. Strong communities do not wait for governments to solve every problem. They organize, cooperate, invest in one another, and build the social trust that makes conflict less likely. Because when people know each other, work together, and share common interests, it becomes far harder to see one another as enemies. Throughout this presentation, we have discussed what governments and host communities must do. But building peaceful and prosperous societies is a shared responsibility. Migrant business communities also have an important role to play. Many migrant entrepreneurs arrived with very little, built businesses under difficult conditions, and contributed significantly to local economies. Yet economic success alone does not create social trust. Trust must be built intentionally. The first step is local inclusion. Where possible, hiring local workers creates a shared stake in success. A business that employs local residents is no longer seen as an outsider's enterprise, but as part of the community itself. Second, Successful business networks should share what they have learned. Cooperative purchasing systems, rotating credit schemes, and wholesale networks have helped many migrant entrepreneurs thrive. Opening these networks to local entrepreneurs can turn competition into partnership. Third, visibility matters. Community investments in schools, clinics, youth programs, sports teams, and local charities demonstrate commitment to the places where businesses operate. Visible contributions challenge the perception that migrants simply take and leave. Organization is equally important. Strong business associations provide representation, legal support, conflict resolution, and a collective voice during times of tension. Knowledge of local laws, rights, and responsibilities also strengthens legitimacy and resilience. Finally, integration requires human connection. Learning local languages, attending community meetings, participating in local events, and building relationships across cultural lines help reduce suspicion and build trust. The message is simple. Belonging is built through participation. Solidarity cannot be demanded while remaining distant from the community around you. When host communities and migrant communities invest in one another, everyone becomes safer, stronger, and more prosperous. The goal is not merely coexistence. The goal is partnership. After spending much of this presentation examining conflict, competition, and division, it is important to end with something equally important: evidence that cooperation works. Too often, public discussions create the impression that tension between local and migrant communities is inevitable. The examples on this slide show that it is not. In Khayelitsha, Cape Town, Somali traders and local South African entrepreneurs chose partnership over rivalry. Instead of fighting for the same opportunities, they combined their strengths. Local partners contributed community relationships and property access. Somali traders contributed wholesale purchasing networks and supply chain expertise. The result was not only stronger businesses, but safer neighborhoods. Crime fell because both communities had a shared interest in protecting what they had built together. In Peckham, London, often called Little Lagos, we see another lesson. A thriving local economy emerged, not from exclusion, but from diversity. Nigerians, Ghanaians, Somalis, and long-term local residents created a commercial hub that serves the community while attracting visitors and investment. Economic success became a bridge rather than a barrier. The Eastleigh district in Nairobi teaches a third lesson. When authorities moved away from treating traders as a security problem and toward legal recognition and formalization, stability improved. People who have legal status, property rights, and a stake in the future are far more likely to invest in their communities and cooperate with institutions. Notice the common pattern across all three examples. The solution was not segregation. The solution was not expulsion. The solution was not violence. The solution was partnership. When communities share opportunity, trust grows. When people have legal recognition, stability grows. When economic incentives align, conflict declines. These examples remind us that the choice is not between migrants succeeding and locals succeeding. The real choice is between competing over scarcity or building prosperity together. The evidence is clear. Where cooperation is encouraged, communities become safer, businesses become stronger, and everyone benefits. The challenge now is not discovering what works. The challenge is finding the political will, leadership, and courage to scale what already works. This slide takes us beyond xenophobic violence and asks a bigger question. What does this mean for Africa's future? When a Somali-owned shop burns in Johannesburg or an Ethiopian restaurant is attacked in Durban, the damage extends far beyond one business. Every attack on fellow Africans weakens trust, disrupts trade, destroys livelihoods, and undermines the dream of African unity. This is the AFCFTA contradiction. In 2018, African leaders signed the African Continental Free Trade Area to promote deeper economic integration across the continent. The vision was simple: Africans trading with Africans, investing in Africans, and building prosperity together. Yet when African-owned businesses are attacked because their owners come from another African country, that vision is challenged at the street level. Integration succeeds or fails not only in government buildings, but in communities. Many of these tensions are also rooted in history. Colonial borders divided communities, cultures, and economic networks that had existed for centuries. As a result, people who share ancestry, history, and interests are often treated as foreigners to one another. At the same time, these conflicts are rarely just cultural. More often, they reflect economic frustration. Communities struggling with unemployment, poverty, and poor services compete over limited opportunities. Economic pain is redirected toward the nearest visible target. That leads to the most important point. Unity is not only a moral ideal, it is an economic strategy. Imagine if migrant business networks, capital pools, logistics systems, and entrepreneurial knowledge were connected with local entrepreneurs, cooperatives, manufacturers, and innovators across Africa. Instead of competing along national lines, Africans could create wealth together. That is Pan-Africanism in practice. Not speeches, Not flags, not conferences, but Africans building, trading, investing, and prospering together. The future of African unity will not be decided only in presidential summits. It will be decided in markets, neighborhoods, businesses, and communities across the continent. Throughout this presentation, we have explored difficult truths. We have examined violence, economic frustration, political manipulation, misinformation, and the human cost of division. We have looked at statistics, history, and lived experiences. But knowledge alone changes nothing. The most important question is, what happens after this presentation ends? This slide is about action. If you live in South Africa, your role begins in your own community. Learn who your neighbors are. Learn the stories behind the businesses on your street. Most prejudice survives because people remain strangers. The moment people know each other's names, families, and struggles, fear begins to lose its power. When tensions rise, do not remain silent. Report incitement, challenge misinformation, and support efforts that protect all businesses and residents, regardless of nationality. If you are a migrant entrepreneur, building a successful business is only part of the responsibility. Visibility, legal compliance, community engagement, and local investment matter. The strongest protection is not only the law, it is trust. Communities are less likely to turn against businesses they see contributing to schools, youth programs, sports clubs, charities, and local development. And for those watching from elsewhere in Africa or across the diaspora, this issue concerns you too. Ideas travel. Narratives travel. Solutions travel. When misinformation spreads online, challenge it with facts. Support organizations promoting African unity and economic cooperation. Advocate for policies that make it easier for Africans to trade, travel, work, and build together across borders. Notice something important about every action on this slide. None requires permission from a president. None requires a government budget. None requires waiting for someone else. Every one of them can begin today. Because social change rarely starts with grand speeches or international agreements. It starts with ordinary people making different choices in their daily lives. One conversation can change a mind. One correction can stop a lie. One act of solidarity can prevent a conflict. And when thousands of people make those choices together, communities change. That is how trust is rebuilt. That is how division is overcome. And that is how the vision of a more united Africa moves from aspiration to reality. It starts here. It starts now. It starts with us. We have reached the end of this journey, but not the end of the conversation. Today we examined a painful reality, violence directed at fellow Africans. We explored the myths that fuel it, the economic pressures that sustain it, the political forces that exploit it, and the human stories behind the headlines. If there is one lesson to take away, it is this. The people fighting each other are rarely the people who created the problem. The Somali shopkeeper did not create South Africa's unemployment crisis. The unemployed South African did not create Somalia's instability. The Nigerian entrepreneur did not create failing public services. The Ethiopian trader did not create inequality. Yet when anger and frustration are redirected toward one another, the real causes remain untouched. That is why this issue matters. When struggling communities fight each other, the system that failed them both escapes accountability. Attention shifts away from corruption, economic exclusion, poor governance, lack of opportunity, and historical injustice. The victims become enemies, while the underlying problems remain unchanged. The evidence we have reviewed points in the same direction. Migrants are not the cause of poverty, and local communities are not the enemy of migrants. More often, both are trying to survive under the same difficult conditions. Pan-Africanism begins with recognizing that truth. It asks us to look beyond nationality, stereotypes, and fear. It reminds us that our futures are connected. When one community suffers, all communities become weaker. When Africans cooperate, trade, invest, and build together, everyone benefits. So the final question is simple. If the evidence shows we are not each other's enemies, if history shows that division weakens us, and if the future demands greater African cooperation than ever before, what choice will we make? Will we continue the cycle of suspicion and blame, or choose solidarity, understanding, and shared prosperity? The answer will not be written by politicians alone. It will be written by ordinary Africans in our communities, our businesses, our conversations, and our daily choices. Because Africa's future will not be determined by those who divide her. It will be determined by those who remember that her destiny has always been greater than her borders. Before you go, help this message reach more people. If you learned something new today, like the video, subscribe for more deep dives, and share this with someone who still thinks Africa is a country. Small conversations can challenge big misconceptions, and every share helps expand understanding. If you want to explore this topic further, scan the QR code for additional resources, courses, recommended readings, maps, and extended discussions. There is far more to Africa than what can fit into a single episode, and this is only the beginning of a much deeper journey into the continent's history, cultures, people, and future. And if you'd like a deeper dive into any topic related to Africa or Pan-Africanism, leave a comment below and we'll cover it in a future video.